Welcome, weary traveler of the modern world. Tonight, we embark on a gentle journey across the vast waters of time, drifting back to an era when the Ming Dynasty's treasure ships ruled the seas like floating palaces of wood and silk. Close your eyes and let your breathing slow as we explore a world both magnificent and harsh, where adventure and suffering sailed hand in hand across the endless blue. Imagine yourself leaving behind the comfort of your warm bed, the safety of your familiar walls, and stepping into the leather boots of a common sailor in the early 15th century. The year is 1433, and you find yourself pressed into service aboard one of the great treasure ships of the Chinese fleet, vessels so large they dwarf anything Europeans have yet dreamed of building. These expeditions, led by the legendary Admiral Zheng He, stretch across 7 epic voyages that would carry Chinese influence from the South China Sea to the eastern shores of Africa. Tonight, as the gentle rhythm of imagined waves lulls your mind toward rest, we will explore the harsh realities that would greet you as an ordinary sailor, the remarkable life of the man who commanded these floating cities, the mysterious disappearance of China's naval power, and finally, the glittering yet treacherous world of the Ming court that made it all possible. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort as we begin this voyage through time, where every detail reveals how different life was in an age when the horizon held both promise and peril in equal measure. Picture yourself awakening not to the gentle chime of an alarm clock, but to the harsh clang of a bronze bell cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Your body aches against the rough hemp matting that serves as your bed, wedged into a space barely wider than your shoulders in the lower deck of a treasure ship. The air around you is thick with the breath of hundreds of men, heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, damp wood, and the ever-present salt spray that penetrates even the deepest recesses of the vessel. Your sleeping quarters, if they can be called that, occupy the lowest deck of the ship, far below the waterline. Here, in what the crew calls the rice bowl of suffering, you share your cramped berth with 5 other sailors. The ceiling above your head measures barely 4 feet high, forcing you to remain perpetually hunched when moving about. The wooden planks beneath you are slick with condensation, and you can hear the constant creaking and groaning of the ship's massive hull as it flexes against the ocean's endless motion. The treasure ship itself is a marvel of engineering that would astound even modern eyes. Stretching over 400 feet in length and 160 feet in width, it towers above the waves like a floating mountain. The ship carries 9 masts, their massive sails billowing like clouds when the wind is favorable. But you, as a common sailor, rarely see these magnificent sails in their full glory. Your world exists primarily in the shadowy depths below, where the hierarchy of the sea places you firmly at the bottom. As you rise from your makeshift bed, your stomach immediately reminds you of its hollow state. The bell that woke you signals not just the beginning of another day, but your first opportunity to receive sustenance in nearly 16 hours. Food aboard the treasure ship operates on a strict rationing system that reflects both practical necessity and social hierarchy. You join the shuffle of men moving toward the communal eating area, their movements slow and careful in the confined space. Your daily ration consists primarily of rice, the staple that keeps the crew alive, but never truly satisfied. The rice is often stale, sometimes moldy, and frequently infested with weevils that you learn to pick out with practiced fingers or simply ignore in your hunger. Accompanying this meager portion might be a small piece of salted fish, so heavily preserved that it resembles leather more than food, or perhaps a few strips of dried vegetables that have lost all color and most of their flavor during the long voyage. Water, that most precious commodity at sea, is carefully measured and jealously guarded. Each sailor receives a daily allowance in a small ceramic cup, the liquid often brackish and warm from storage in the ship's holds. The constant motion of the sea means that spilling even a drop is even a minor tragedy that could leave you parched until the next distribution. You learn to cup your hands protectively around your water ration, savoring each warm, somewhat metallic sip. The hierarchy aboard the ship manifests itself most clearly at mealtimes. While you consume your meager rations in the dim lower decks, the officers and administrators dine on the upper levels, their meals including fresh fruits preserved in honey, dried meats of superior quality, and even occasionally fresh fish caught from the sea. The aroma of their cooking sometimes drifts down to where you eat, a cruel reminder of your position in this floating society. After the brief respite of breakfast, your real work begins. The treasure ship, despite its massive size, requires constant maintenance and operation. Your first duty often involves working the enormous sails, a task that demands the coordinated effort of dozens of men. The ropes are thick as your arm and rough enough to strip skin from your palms within days. The wind that fills the sails is both friend and enemy. Favorable winds mean easier sailing, but also more intensive work to manage the ship's speed and direction. When the wind fails, as it often does in the tropical doldrums through which these expeditions frequently pass, you find yourself assigned to the oars. The treasure ships, for all their magnificence, sometimes require the brute force of human muscle to maintain progress. The oars themselves are massive wooden beams that require 4 men to operate effectively. Hour after hour, you pull in rhythm with your fellow sailors, your back burning with the strain, your hands developing layers of calluses that crack and bleed before hardening into permanent armor against the wood. The heat below decks during these rowing sessions becomes almost unbearable. The air grows thick and stifling, filled with the sounds of heavy breathing and occasional groans of exhaustion. Sweat pours from your body, soaking your simple cotton clothing and making your grip on the oar handle slippery and uncertain. The overseer, a junior officer with a bamboo rod, walks among the rowers, occasionally striking those whose rhythm falters or whose strength appears to flag. Disease spreads quickly in these confined conditions. Dysentery runs rampant through the crew, turning the already miserable existence into something far worse. The ship's limited medical facilities consist mainly of an elderly physician who treats most ailments with acupuncture, herbal teas, and resignation. You watch fellow sailors grow gaunt and weak, their eyes hollow with illness and malnutrition. Some disappear from their sleeping places, their bodies committed to the sea with brief ceremonies that emphasize the temporary nature of human existence. The storms test every aspect of your endurance. When the weather turns violent, as it frequently does during monsoon season, the treasure ship becomes a prison of terror. Massive waves crash over the deck above, sending water cascading through every crack and seam into your living quarters. The ship pitches and rolls with such violence that you cannot stand, cannot eat, can barely think beyond the immediate need to avoid being thrown against the wooden walls with bomb-crushing force. During these tempests, you remain trapped below decks, listening to the terrifying sounds of the storm's fury above. The wind howls like a living thing, and you can hear the groaning protests of the ship's wooden structure as it flexes and bends under the assault. Your stomach churns not just from hunger, but from the constant motion, and the air becomes thick with the smell of vomit and fear. Sleep becomes impossible, and you spend hours clinging to whatever handholds you can find, praying to whatever gods might listen that the ship will survive another night. The work never ends, even in calm weather. The ship requires constant cleaning, as the combination of so many men living in close quarters with limited sanitation creates conditions that demand vigilant maintenance. You scrub decks with brushes made from coarse fibers, whole buckets of seawater for washing, and spend hours repairing the endless minor damages that accumulate from daily use. Your hands remain permanently stained and roughened from the constant contact with salt water, tar, and rough wood. Navigation and sailing require specialized skills that take years to master, but as a common sailor, you perform the simpler, more physically demanding tasks that keep the ship functioning. You might spend days working with hemp and tart to repair sections of rigging, your fingers growing black with the sticky substance that seems to penetrate every pore of your skin. The smell of tar becomes as familiar as your own breath, a constant reminder of your maritime prison. The social isolation weighs heavily on the spirit. Conversation among the common sailors tends toward the basic necessities of survival, complaints about food, observations about the weather, speculation about when the voyage might end. The officers maintain strict discipline and do not encourage familiarity between the ranks. You find yourself longing for the simple human connections that life on land provides, the casual conversations with neighbors, the comfort of familiar surroundings, the basic dignity of privacy. Yet even in these harsh conditions, moments of beauty occasionally break through the hardship. Sometimes, during the brief periods when you are allowed on deck, you witness sunsets that paint the ocean in colors so magnificent they seem to justify all the suffering that brought you to that moment. The sight of dolphins playing in the ship's wake, or the majesty of other treasure ships sailing in formation across the endless blue, reminds you that you are part of something greater than your individual misery. The treasure ships carry more than goods and diplomatic messages. They transport the hopes and ambitions of an entire civilization across waters that connect distant worlds. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine yourself finally understanding that your small role in this grand enterprise, however uncomfortable and demanding, connects you to one of the most remarkable maritime achievements in human history. The waves rock you gently now, and the hardships of that ancient sailor's life fade into the comfortable distance of time, leaving only the wonder of human ambition and endurance to carry you toward peaceful rest. As your mind drifts from the cramped quarters of the common sailor, let it rise through the layers of the great ship to encounter a figure whose life embodied the contradictions and complexities of imperial China. Zheng He, born Ma He in the remote mountains of Yunnan province around 1371, would transform from a captured child into the most powerful naval commander in Chinese history, his story unfolding like the gradual unfurling of a treasure ship's massive sails. Picture the young Ma He in his earliest years, growing up in a Muslim family in a land where his people were considered outsiders by the dominant Han Chinese culture. His father, Ma Haji, was a minor official who had completed the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey that would later influence his son's understanding of distant lands and diverse peoples. The boy grew tall and strong in the thin mountain air, his early life shaped by the rhythms of trade caravans that passed through Yunnan carrying goods between China and the Islamic kingdoms to the west. The turning point of his existence came with brutal suddenness when he was approximately 10 years old. The Ming armies, consolidating their control over the former Yuan dynasty territories, swept through Yunnan like a relentless tide. The campaign was particularly savage toward Muslim communities, and young Ma, he watched his father die in the violence that accompanied the conquest. The boy himself was captured, torn from everything familiar, and subjected to the cruel transformation that would paradoxically become the foundation of his future power. Castration was the price of survival for many captured boys in this period, a practice that simultaneously removed them from the normal hierarchies of Chinese society, while opening pathways to positions of trust within the imperial system. The physical agony of this procedure, performed without anesthesia or proper medical care, was matched by the psychological trauma of losing his family, his home, and his very identity as a whole man. Yet Ma He endured, displaying even in childhood the remarkable resilience that would later carry him across unknown seas. Following his castration, the boy was assigned to serve Prince Judi, the fourth son of the founding Ming Emperor. This assignment, seemingly just another administrative detail in the vast imperial bureaucracy, would prove to be the pivot around which his extraordinary life would turn. Prince Judi recognized something exceptional in the young eunuch, an intelligence that shone through even the traumatic circumstances of his arrival, a natural authority that commanded respect despite his humble origins. As Ma He grew to manhood in the prince's service, he distinguished himself not just through loyalty, but through an almost supernatural ability to understand military strategy and logistics. His height, unusual for Chinese men of the period, combined with his commanding presence and deep voice, made him a natural leader despite his status as a eunuch. When Prince Judi launched his rebellion against his nephew, the Jianwen Emperor, Ma He proved himself invaluable both as a military strategist and as a trusted confidant who could never threaten the prince's lineage through children of his own. The civil war that elevated Prince Judi to the throne as the Yongluo Emperor was characterized by shifting alliances and brutal battles that raged across northern China for several years. Ma He's role in securing victory for his master involved not just military tactics, but the complex art of logistics, ensuring that armies remained fed, supplied, and motivated across vast distances and through multiple campaign seasons. His talent for organization on a massive scale would later prove essential when managing expeditions involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. When Prince Judi finally claimed the Dragon Throne in 1403, one of his first acts was to honor those who had supported him the dark years of rebellion. Ma He, now a man of 32, found himself elevated to extraordinary heights for someone of his background. The emperor bestowed upon him the surname Zheng, and he became known as Zheng He, a name that would echo through the centuries. More importantly, he was appointed to lead an entirely new kind of imperial venture, naval expeditions that would carry Chinese power and influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Middle Kingdom. The emperor's decision to entrust Zheng He with command of the treasure fleets reflected both practical considerations and deeper imperial ambitions. As a eunuch, Zheng He could never establish a dynasty or threaten the emperor's lineage. His Muslim background actually proved advantageous, as many of the lands the expeditions would visit had significant Muslim populations who might view a Chinese Muslim admiral more favorably than a traditional Confucian official. His proven administrative abilities and personal loyalty made him the ideal instrument for projecting imperial power across the vast distances of the Indian Ocean. Preparing for the first expedition, I had organizational skills on a scale before attempted in human history. Zheng He oversaw the construction of shipyards at Nanjing capable of building vessels larger than anything previously conceived. The logistics of provisioning a fleet carrying nearly 30,000 men demanded the coordination of resources from across the empire. Rice had to be stockpiled, water containers manufactured by the thousands, weapons forged and distributed, and sailors recruited from coastal provinces where maritime skills were traditional. The admiral's personal quarters aboard the flagship reflected his unique position in the imperial hierarchy. Unlike the cramped conditions endured by common sailors, Zheng He occupied a spacious cabin fitted with carved wooden furniture, silk hangings, and shelves lined with books on navigation, astronomy, and the customs of foreign lands. His private altar combined Buddhist and Islamic elements, reflecting the syncretic spirituality that characterized his personal beliefs. Here, in the gentle rocking motion of the great ship, he would spend hours studying charts and planning the complex diplomatic encounters that awaited in distant ports. Yet even in his elevated position, Zheng He remained intimately connected to the practical realities of maritime life. He understood that successful voyages depended not just on imperial authority, but on the morale and efficiency of every sailor under his command. He made regular inspections of the lower decks, ensuring that food was distributed fairly and that discipline was maintained without excessive cruelty. His commanding presence — he stood nearly 7 feet tall, and his reputation for both justice and determination earned him the respect of men who might otherwise resent serving under a eunuch. The diplomatic aspects of Zheng He's role required skills that went far beyond naval command. At each port of call, he served as the personal representative of the Chinese emperor, bearing gifts of silk, porcelain, and tea while expecting tribute and acknowledgement of Chinese suzerainty in return. These encounters demanded not just linguistic ability. Zheng He spoke Arabic and several Southeast Asian languages in addition to Chinese, but also a sophisticated understanding of local customs and religious practices. His approach to diplomacy combined the demonstration of overwhelming Chinese power with genuine respect for local traditions. When calling at Colombo in Ceylon, he would honor both Buddhist and Hindu temples, making appropriate offerings while ensuring that the treasure ship's impressive presence conveyed the might of the Ming dynasty. In the Muslim ports of the Indian Ocean, his own religious background allowed him to engage with local rulers on terms of spiritual as well as political equality. The personal cost of command weighed heavily on Zheng He throughout the 7 great expeditions he led between 1405 and 1433. Each voyage lasted 2 or 3 years, keeping him away from China for extended periods during which he bore responsibility for the lives of tens of thousands of men. The constant pressure of navigation in unfamiliar waters, the management of complex diplomatic negotiations, and the logistics of maintaining such massive expeditions in motion across vast distances would have broken men of lesser determination. His private writings, preserved in fragments, reveal moments of profound loneliness despite his position of supreme authority. The combination of his eunuch status, his Muslim faith, and his role as naval commander set him apart from virtually every social group in Chinese society. He could never marry, never have children, never retire to the simple pleasures of family life that sustained other men through the hardships of imperial service. His devotion to the emperor and to the grand vision of Chinese maritime dominance became his entire existence, filling the void left by all the normal human connections his circumstances had denied him. The technical challenges of commanding the treasure fleets required Zheng He to master skills that combined ancient Chinese traditions with innovations born of necessity. Navigation in the open ocean demanded astronomical knowledge, the ability to read wind patterns and ocean currents, and the interpretation of subtle signs that indicated the presence of land beyond the visible horizon. He studied the flight patterns of seabirds, the color changes in ocean water, and the formation of clouds that might indicate distant mountains, where the prediction became a matter of life and death when commanding fleets of such size and value. Zheng He developed an almost mystical ability to sense approaching storms, ordering his ships to seek shelter or alter course based on observations that seemed supernatural to less experienced sailors. His reputation for navigational wisdom grew with each successful voyage, adding to his authority and making his orders unquestioned, even in the most desperate circumstances. The economic implications of the treasure voyages weighed constantly on Zheng He's mind. Each expedition cost the imperial treasury enormous sums, money that could have been spent on domestic improvements or defense against northern barbarians. He understood that the continuation of his maritime program depended on demonstrating concrete benefits to the empire, whether through tribute relationships, trade advantages, or the simple projection of Chinese prestige that discouraged potential enemies from testing Ming power. As the years passed and political winds in the capital began to shift, Zheng He found himself defending just his expeditions, but his entire worldview. Confucian officials, who had never fully supported the massive expenditure of resources on overseas adventures, argued that China's future lay in internal development and defense of traditional borders, rather than costly expeditions to distant lands. The death of his patron, the Yongle Emperor, in 1424 marked the beginning of the end for the great age of Chinese naval exploration. Zheng He's final years were spent watching the gradual dismantling of everything he had built. The treasure ships were allowed to rot in their moorings, the shipyards at Nanjing were converted to other uses, and China began its long retreat from the seas that would leave maritime dominance to Portuguese, Dutch, and English successors. He died around 1433, possibly during his 7th and final voyage, his body committed to the waves he had mastered so completely. As you drift deeper into peaceful sleep, let your mind hold the image of Zheng He standing on the deck of his flagship, gazing out at the endless ocean that had been his kingdom. His story reminds us that individual lives, no matter how extraordinary, remain subject to the larger currents of history, rising and falling with the tides of imperial ambition and political change. The waves that once carried his great fleet now whisper only memories, gentle sounds that carry you toward rest and dreams of distant shores, where the past becomes as peaceful as the present moment of your comfortable repose. Let your mind drift now like morning mist across the harbor at Nanjing, where once the greatest shipyards in the world hummed with activity, where the sound of hammers on wood and the voices of thousands of craftsmen created a symphony of imperial ambition. Today, archaeologists walk these same grounds, their careful excavations revealing only fragments of what was once a maritime empire that spanned half the globe. The mystery of how and why China abandoned the seas remains one of history's most haunting puzzles, a riddle wrapped in the complexities of imperial politics, economic pressures, and cultural values that seem almost impossible to reconcile with the magnitude of what was lost. Picture yourself standing in the Forbidden City in the year 1435, just 2 years after Zheng He's final voyage. The courtyards that once bustled with preparations for naval expeditions now echo with different conversations. Confucian scholars, their long robes rustling softly as they walk, speak in measured tones about the proper ordering of society, the importance of agriculture over commerce, the wisdom of focusing imperial resources on internal development rather than costly adventures in foreign lands. Their voices carry the weight of ancient tradition, the accumulated wisdom of centuries that viewed the ocean not as a highway to opportunity, but as a barrier separating the civilized world from barbarian chaos. The transformation began subtly, like the slow turning of a tide that initially appears to be merely the normal ebb and flow of imperial priorities. When the Yongle Emperor died in 1424, his son who became the Hongxi Emperor ruled for less than a year. But even in that brief period, the direction of policy began to shift. The new emperor's advisors whispered in his ear about the enormous costs of the treasure voyages, the drain on the imperial treasury that could better serve the people through tax relief, agricultural improvements, and strengthening the defenses against Mongol raiders who threatened China's northern borders. The Xuandi Emperor, who succeeded his father in 1425, initially appeared to support continued naval exploration. It was under his reign that Zheng He's seventh and final voyage departed, carrying with it the last gasp of Chinese maritime ambition. Yet even this expedition reflected changing priorities. It was smaller than its predecessors, more focused on trade than exploration, and burdened with officials who viewed it skeptically as an expensive indulgence rather than a strategic necessity. Behind the public pronouncements about fiscal responsibility, deep currents of philosophical and cultural resistance to maritime expansion. The Confucian worldview that dominated Chinese intellectual life held that the Middle Kingdom was the center of civilization, that foreign lands were by definition inferior and barbarian, and that contact with such places could only contaminate the purity of Chinese culture. The treasure voyages, with their emphasis on diplomacy and trade with distant kingdoms, challenged this fundamental assumption by suggesting that foreign rulers might be treated as equals rather than supplicants, seeking the benevolence of the Son of Heaven. The economic arguments against the voyages carried particular weight during a period when the empire faced multiple challenges. The northern frontier required constant military attention and enormous expenditure to maintain the Great Wall and garrison the border fortresses that protected China from Mongol incursions. The Yellow River, that temperamental waterway that was both the lifeblood and the curse of northern China, demanded frequent and costly engineering projects to prevent devastating floods. The empire's internal infrastructure, roads, canals, granaries, and administrative buildings required continuous maintenance and improvement to keep the vast nation functioning effectively. When imperial accountants calculated the costs of a single treasure voyage, the numbers were staggering. The construction and outfitting of the great ships consumed the timber of entire forests. The provisions required to sustain tens of thousands of sailors 4 years at sea represented the agricultural output of whole provinces, and the luxury goods carried as diplomatic gifts depleted the imperial workshops and storehouses. Conservative estimates suggest that each major expedition cost the equivalent of several years' worth of tax revenue from wealthy provinces, money that could have supported hundreds of smaller, but more immediately beneficial domestic projects. Yet the mystery deepens when we consider what China lost by abandoning the seas. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Indian Ocean reveals the extent of Chinese influence during the treasure voyage era. Chinese coins have been found in East African ports, Chinese ceramics in Arabian markets, and Chinese-style anchor stones along the coasts of India and Southeast Asia. The network of diplomatic relationships that Zheng He established had begun to create a vast sphere of Chinese influence that might have prevented European colonization of these regions and fundamentally altered the course of world history. The technological achievements represented by the treasure ships themselves remain almost incomprehensible in their scale and sophistication. The largest vessels, according to contemporary Chinese sources, measured over 600 feet in length, dimensions that would not be equaled by European shipbuilders for several centuries. These floating cities incorporated advanced features such as watertight bulkheads, sophisticated rudder systems, and multiple masts that could be adjusted independently to optimize performance in different wind conditions. The navigation techniques employed by Chinese admirals, combining astronomical observation with detailed knowledge of monsoon patterns and ocean currents, represented centuries of accumulated maritime wisdom that was simply allowed to atrophy through disuse. Modern researchers have struggled to understand the physical evidence of this lost maritime civilization. The shipyards at Nanjing, where archaeologists have uncovered massive dry docks carved from solid rock, reveal construction techniques that seem almost impossible for the period. The docks themselves are so large that some scholars initially refused to believe they could have been used for shipbuilding, suggesting instead that they might have been decorative pools or ceremonial spaces. Only when the scale of the treasure ships became clear did the true purpose of these enormous excavations become apparent. The disappearance of the ships themselves adds another layer to the mystery. Contemporary accounts describe hundreds of vessels of various sizes, from the massive treasure ships down to smaller support craft that carried supplies, troops, and specialized equipment. Yet virtually no physical remains of these vessels have ever been discovered. Some scholars suggest that the ships were systematically dismantled when the voyages ended, their valuable timber and metal fittings recycled for other imperial projects. Others propose that they were allowed to rot in their moorings, eventually sinking to the bottom of rivers and harbors where their remains lie buried under centuries of sediment. The human cost of this abandonment becomes clear when we consider the fate of the thousands of sailors, craftsmen, and officials whose lives had been devoted to the maritime enterprise. Experienced navigators found themselves reassigned to river transport duties, their knowledge of ocean sailing gradually forgotten as they adapted to the simpler requirements of inland navigation. Shipwrights who had mastered the complex techniques needed to construct ocean-going vessels were redirected to building smaller craft for lakes and rivers, their skills in creating watertight bulkheads and installing sophisticated rigging systems becoming obsolete within a generation. The diplomatic consequences rippled across the Indian Ocean world like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Kings and sultans, who had grown accustomed to the regular arrival of Chinese fleets, with their impressive demonstrations of imperial power and their generous distributions of silk, porcelain, and other luxury goods, found themselves suddenly isolated from this source of prestige and material benefit. Some attempted to maintain contact by sending their own diplomatic missions to China, but these smaller-scale efforts lacked the impact and regularity of the treasure voyages. Perhaps most tragically, the knowledge gained from nearly 3 decades of systematic exploration was largely lost or ignored. Chinese charts of the Indian Ocean, compiled through careful observation and measurement during the treasure voyages, represented the most accurate geographic information available anywhere in the world at the time. These maps, showing detailed coastlines, noting the locations of reefs and safe harbors, and recording wind patterns and seasonal weather changes, could have served as the foundation for continued Chinese maritime expansion. Instead, they were filed away in imperial archives where they gathered dust, their strategic value unrecognized by officials who had no interest in ocean navigation. The cultural amnesia that followed was perhaps the most complete aspect of the disappearance. Within a few generations, the treasure voyages had become legendary rather than historical, their actual achievements exaggerated into mythical proportions that made them easier to dismiss as impossible fantasies. Chinese literature and poetry, which might have preserved memories of the great expeditions, instead focused on more traditional themes of agricultural life, family relationships, and moral instruction. The sea, which had briefly been celebrated as a highway to glory, returned to its traditional role in Chinese culture as a dangerous boundary within the edge of the civilized world. Modern attempts to reconstruct the treasure ships have revealed the extraordinary challenges involved in their construction and operation. Naval architects working with traditional Chinese shipbuilding techniques have struggled to create vessels even half the size of the largest treasure ships, finding that the engineering problems involved in constructing and sailing such enormous wooden vessels push the limits of pre-industrial technology. This research has only deepened the mystery of how Chinese shipwrights of the early Ming period managed to build and successfully operate fleets of such unprecedented size and sophistication. The environmental evidence provides additional clues to the mystery. Core samples taken from lake beds near the Nanjing shipyards show dramatic changes in pollen composition during the treasure voyage period, indicating massive deforestation as entire forests were harvested to supply timber for ship construction. When the voyages ended, these same samples show rapid reforestation, suggesting that the demand for shipbuilding timber disappeared almost overnight. The environmental impact of the treasure ship program had been enormous, requiring the systematic exploitation of natural resources on a scale that would not be seen again until the industrial age. Archaeological investigations of port cities along the treasure ship routes reveal a similar pattern of sudden abandonment. Warehouses that had been built to store Chinese goods show evidence of rapid disuse, their contents cleared out and their structures converted to other purposes. Harbor facilities that had been expanded to accommodate the enormous Chinese vessels were allowed to decay, their stone foundations gradually covered by sand and silt as smaller local boats replaced the great ships from the north. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your bed, imagine the last Chinese admiral to sail these waters, perhaps a junior officer who had served under Zhonghe, watching the familiar coastlines fade behind him for the final time. He carries with him the knowledge of winds and currents, of safe harbors and dangerous reefs, of the customs and languages of dozens of foreign ports, knowledge that will die with him because his emperor has decided that China's future lies not on the vast ocean, but within the familiar boundaries of the Middle Kingdom. The waves that once carried the treasure ships continue their eternal motion, indifferent to human ambition and imperial decree. The mystery of China's retreat from the seas reminds us that even the greatest achievements of human civilization remain fragile, subject to the changing winds of politics and philosophy. As sleep approaches, let this ancient mystery become a gentle puzzle that requires no solution, a question that dissolves into the peaceful certainty that all things pass, leaving only the quiet rhythm of time itself to carry you toward rest. Allow your consciousness to drift now from the endless ocean back to dry land, floating like incense smoke through the vermilion gates and golden-tiled roofs of the Forbidden City. Here, behind walls 20 feet high and moats filled with lotus blossoms, existed a world so removed from ordinary human experience that it might have been another planet entirely. The Ming imperial court, with its thousands of eunuchs, concubines, and officials, created a universe governed by ritual so precise and hierarchy so absolute that a single misstep in protocol could mean the difference between elevation and execution. Picture yourself in the pre-dawn darkness of the Forbidden City in the year 1420, when the treasure fleet still sailed and the empire stretched its influence across known and unknown seas. The silence is profound, broken only by the soft footsteps of palace eunuchs, as they begin their daily preparations for the complex ceremonies that will govern every moment of the emperor's existence. These men, surgically separated from the normal world of family and progeny, move through the corridors like shadows, their lives devoted entirely to maintaining the elaborate fiction that the Son of Heaven is a divine being whose every action carries cosmic significance. The eunuch system, which would have horrified you, as that sailor pressed into service aboard the treasure ships, represented the dark foundation upon which imperial power rested. Boys, some as young as 8 or 9, were subjected to the brutal procedure that would forever separate them from normal masculine identity. The operation itself, performed without anesthesia in unsanitary conditions, killed perhaps 1 in 10 of those who underwent it. Those who survived faced weeks of agonizing recovery, during which they learned the first harsh lesson of palace life, that individual suffering was insignificant compared to the needs of the imperial system. Yet for those who survived and demonstrated intelligence, ambition, and loyalty, the eunuch system offered pathways to power that would have been unimaginable in the normal world outside the palace walls. The highest-ranking eunuchs wielded influence that exceeded that of provincial governors, commanding vast bureaucracies and controlling access to the emperor himself. They accumulated wealth that dwarfed the fortunes of successful merchants, living in luxury apartments within the palace complex and maintaining staffs of subordinate eunuchs who catered to their every need. The daily routine of a senior eunuch began before dawn with elaborate preparations that transformed him from a sleeping human being into a living symbol of imperial authority. His clothing, specified down to the smallest detail by ancient protocol, consisted of silk robes whose colors and patterns indicated his precise rank within the palace hierarchy. The process of dressing required the assistance of junior eunuchs, as the formal court costume was so complex and delicate that a single individual could not manage it alone. Every fold of fabric had to fall in exactly the prescribed manner, every ornament positioned with mathematical precision. The emperor himself, the focus of all this elaborate ceremony, lived a life that combined absolute power with profound isolation. His day began with ritual ablutions performed by eunuchs who had been selected for this honor through years of loyal service and demonstrated competence. The process of awakening the Son of Heaven urged the coordination of dozens of palace servants, each responsible for a specific aspect of the morning routine. The emperor's clothing, like that of his servants, but infinitely more elaborate, took hours to arrange properly, with each garment carrying symbolic significance related to cosmic forces, seasonal changes, and imperial virtues. Breakfast for the emperor represented not a simple meal, but a religious ceremony that connected the imperial person to the fundamental forces governing the universe. The food itself, prepared by cooks who had spent decades mastering their craft, consisted of dozens of courses arranged with artistic precision on porcelain vessels created specifically for imperial use. Each dish had to be tasted by designated eunuchs to ensure that it contained no poison, a precaution that reflected the constant underlying tension between the emperor's theoretical omnipotence and his practical vulnerability to those who surrounded him. The emperor's interactions with his officials followed protocols so rigid that they resembled theatrical performances more than normal human conversations. When meeting with ministers or receiving reports from provincial administrators, the emperor sat on a throne positioned to emphasize his elevation above ordinary mortals, while his subjects prostrated themselves according to rules that specified the exact angle of their bows, the number of times they should touch their foreheads to the ground, and the precise phrases they must use when addressing their divine ruler. Yet behind this facade of unlimited authority, the emperor's actual freedom was severely constrained by the very system that elevated him above other men. His choice of clothing was dictated by ancient tradition, his daily schedule determined by cosmic considerations that required astronomical calculations, and his public statements filtered through advisors who ensured that imperial pronouncements conformed to Confucian ideals and historical precedent. The emperor might rule an empire of millions, but he could not take a simple walk in a garden without elaborate preparations involving dozens of servants and guards. The imperial harem represented another dimension of the court's complex social architecture. Hundreds of women, selected for their beauty and family connections, lived lives of luxurious imprisonment within the palace complex. These concubines, ranked in a hierarchy as elaborate as that governing the eunuchs, competed for the emperor's attention and the possibility of bearing a son who might someday inherit the throne. Their days were spent in activities designed to maintain their physical beauty and cultural accomplishments, music lessons, poetry composition, embroidery work, and the study of classical literature. The concubines' living quarters, while magnificent by the standards of the world outside the palace, were nonetheless prison cells disguised as luxury apartments. The women could never leave the forbidden city, could never see their families without imperial permission, and could never form normal relationships with men other than the emperor himself. Their beauty, which had gained them entry to the palace, became a burden as they aged, their value to the imperial system declining with each passing year that failed to produce an heir. Competition among the concubines could be vicious, involving elaborate schemes to gain imperial favor and equally complex plots to discredit rivals. The emperor's attention was the ultimate prize, as pregnancy by the Son of Heaven offered the only path to lasting security and elevated status within the harem hierarchy. Yet even pregnancy brought new dangers, as the birth of potential heirs triggered political calculations that could result in the elimination of threats to the succession. Infant mortality in the imperial harem was suspiciously high, and many concubines who bore sons found their children dying from mysterious illnesses that court physicians seemed powerless to prevent. The economic foundation supporting this elaborate court system hired the coordinated effort of an empire of over 60 million people. Tax collectors fanned out across China's provinces, gathering rice, silk, porcelain, and silver that would be transported to the capital to sustain the thousands of individuals whose lives were devoted to maintaining imperial ceremonies. The transportation of these resources required vast networks of canals, roads, and administrative centers staffed by officials whose loyalty to the system was maintained through a combination of generous rewards and terrifying punishments. The manufacture of luxury goods for court use represented one of the most sophisticated industrial enterprises in the world. Imperial workshops employed master craftsmen who spent their entire careers perfecting techniques for creating porcelain, silk, lacquerware, and jewelry that met the impossibly high standards demanded by imperial taste. These artisans, while more fortunate than the eunuchs and concubines in that they could maintain normal family lives, nonetheless found their creative freedom severely limited by traditional designs and ancient precedents that left little room for innovation or personal expression. The intellectual life of the court revolved around the study and interpretation of classical texts that were believed to contain all necessary wisdom for governing the empire. Confucian scholars, recruited through competitive examinations that tested their mastery of ancient literature and philosophy, served as the emperor's advisors on questions ranging from agricultural policy to diplomatic protocol. These men, despite their education and theoretical influence, remained as constrained by tradition and protocol as everyone else in the palace complex. The examination system that selected these scholar officials represented both the glory and the limitation of Chinese intellectual culture. Candidates spent decades memorizing classical texts, learning to write in approved styles, and mastering the complex art of policy analysis based on historical precedent. Success in these examinations could elevate a poor farmer's son to positions of enormous influence, but the intellectual framework that governed the system discouraged original thinking and innovation in favor of orthodox interpretations of ancient wisdom. Palace intrigue flourished in this environment where proximity to imperial favor could mean the difference between wealth and poverty, honor and disgrace, life and death. Eunuchs formed factions that competed for influence over imperial policy. Scholar officials maneuvered to advance their careers while undermining their rivals, and concubines engaged in elaborate conspiracies designed to position their children for succession to the throne. The emperor, theoretically omniscient and all-powerful, often found himself manipulated by courtiers who controlled the flow of information reaching the imperial presence. The contrast between the magnificent facade of court life and the brutal realities underlying it becomes clear when we consider the fate of those who fell from imperial favor. A eunuch who displeased the emperor might find himself stripped of his rank, his property confiscated, and his life ended with a speed that left no time for appeal or explanation. Concubines who were suspected of disloyalty could be sentenced to death by slow strangulation, their bodies buried in unmarked graves within the palace complex. Scholar officials who challenged imperial policy too vigorously had been banished to remote provinces where they would spend their remaining years in poverty and isolation. Yet the system persisted for centuries precisely because it provided stability and order for the vast Chinese empire. The elaborate ceremonies and rigid hierarchies that constrained individual freedom also created predictable patterns of governance that allowed millions of people to live their lives with reasonable security. The economic costs of maintaining the imperial court were enormous, but they were distributed across a population large enough to bear them without excessive hardship. The concentration of wealth and power in the Forbidden City created inequalities that would appall modern sensibilities, but it also supported cultural achievements in art, literature, and philosophy that enriched human civilization. The twilight years of individual lives within the palace system were often marked by a profound melancholy that no amount of luxury could dispel. Elderly eunuchs, their usefulness to the imperial system declining with age, found themselves gradually excluded from the centers of power they had once inhabited. Aging concubines, no longer capable of attracting imperial attention, spent their final years in increasingly modest apartments. Their beauty faded and their relevance to court politics ended. Even successful scholar officials eventually reached the point where younger men with more current knowledge and stronger political connections displaced them from positions of influence. As you sink deeper into the comfort of your modern bed, let your mind drift through those ancient palace corridors where thousands of people lived lives of magnificent captivity. The contrast between their gilded prison and your simple freedom becomes a source of gratitude rather than anxiety, a reminder that the most elaborate achievements of human civilization often exact prices that only become apparent when viewed from the safe distance of centuries. The emperors who commanded treasure fleets and the courtiers who served them have all returned to dust, their elaborate ceremonies and rigid hierarchies dissolved into the same peaceful silence that now surrounds your rest. The night wind that once stirred the silk banners of the Forbidden City continues to blow, carrying with it only whispers of ancient glory and long-forgotten ambitions. Let these echoes of imperial China become the gentlest of lullabies, reminding you that all human complexity eventually simplifies into the basic rhythms of breath and heartbeat that carry you toward the democratic peace of sleep, where emperors and sailors, eunuchs and concubines all share the same dreamless rest. As our journey through the world of China's treasure ships draws to a gentle close, let your mind drift one final time across the vast expanse of time that separates you from those distant sailors, that legendary admiral, and the glittering court that sent them forth. The centuries have flowed like ocean currents, carrying away the physical evidence of their achievements while leaving behind only fragments and whispers, archaeological puzzles, and historical mysteries that scholars continue to contemplate in quiet libraries far removed from the salt spray and creaking timbers of those magnificent expeditions. The sailor whose harsh existence we first explored, cramped in the lower decks with his meager rations and endless toil, has long since returned to the earth that bore him. His struggles with rope burn and seasickness, his hunger and exhaustion, his brief glimpses of sunset splendor over foreign waters, all have dissolved into the universal human experience of endurance and wonder that connects his ancient world to your comfortable present. The waves that rocked his restless sleep continue their eternal motion, indifferent to the rise and fall of dynasties, the building and abandonment of treasure fleets, the grand ambitions of emperors, and the simple needs of common men. Zheng himself, that towering figure whose life embodied the contradictions of his age, found his final rest somewhere in the vastness of the Indian Ocean, his body committed to waters that had been his kingdom for nearly 3 decades. The charts he created, the diplomatic relationships he forged, the technical innovations he pioneered, all have faded into historical curiosity, their practical value lost when China chose to turn its back on the sea. Yet his example endures as a reminder that individual lives, however extraordinary, remain part of larger currents that sweep civilizations toward destinies no single person can fully control or comprehend. The mystery of China's retreat from maritime dominance continues to puzzle historians and archaeologists, their patient excavations and careful analysis slowly reconstructing the outlines of what was lost when the treasure ships were abandoned to rot in their moorings. The political calculations that led to this decision, seemingly rational to the Confucian scholars who advocated for domestic priorities over foreign adventures, now appear tragically short-sighted when viewed against the backdrop of European expansion that filled the vacuum left by Chinese withdrawal. Yet perhaps there is wisdom in recognizing that even the most consequential historical decisions were made by fallible human beings operating within the constraints of their time and culture, their vision limited by assumptions and beliefs that seemed as natural to them as our own convictions seem to us. The imperial court that authorized and then abandoned these expeditions has likewise returned to dust, its elaborate ceremonies and rigid hierarchies surviving only in written records and architectural ruins that tourists photograph while trying to imagine the human reality behind the magnificent facades. The eunuchs who wielded power through proximity to imperial favor, the concubines who competed for attention and the chance to bear an heir, the scholar officials who shaped policy through their mastery of classical texts, all participated in a system that seemed eternal and unshakable to those who lived within it, yet proved as transient as morning mist when the winds of change began to blow. There is profound comfort in this perspective, a gentle reminder that the pressures and anxieties that sometimes disturb our own rest are likewise temporary, part of historical moments that will pass as surely as the Ming dynasty passed, leaving behind only memories and lessons for those who come after. The technological marvels that astound us today, our smartphones and satellites, our global communications and instant access to information, will someday seem as quaint and primitive to future generations as Zheng He's compass and star charts seem to us now. Yet something essential persists across these vast spans of time, something that connects the sailor shivering in his hammock to you settling into your warm bed, something that links Admiral Zheng He plotting his course by celestial navigation to modern travelers booking flights online. It is the fundamental human capacity for wonder, the irrepressible curiosity that drives us to explore unknown territories, whether they lie across distant oceans or within the landscapes of our own imagination. The same spirit that sent Chinese treasure ships to the coasts of Africa continues to send human beings toward the stars. The same desire for connection and understanding that motivated diplomatic missions to foreign courts now manifests in global networks that span the planet in milliseconds. The practical lessons embedded in these ancient stories offer their own form of comfort. The sailor's entrance reminds us that human beings possess remarkable capacity for adaptation and survival, that we can bear hardships that seem unimaginable when viewed from positions of comfort and security. Zheng He's example demonstrates that individuals can transcend the limitations of their circumstances, that vision and determination can transform personal tragedy into historical achievement, that leadership often emerges from the most unlikely backgrounds and unexpected combinations of experience. The mystery of the lost treasure fleet teaches us about the impermanence of human institutions and the importance of preserving knowledge and skills that may seem expendable in one era, but prove invaluable in another. The imperial court's elaborate ceremonies and hierarchies remind us that all social systems, however rigid and established they may appear, rest ultimately on the consent and participation of individual human beings who can choose to sustain or abandon them as circumstances change. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness, imagine yourself floating above the vast Pacific Ocean, looking down through the darkness toward waters that once carried those great treasure ships on their journeys between worlds. The surface is peaceful now, its gentle swells reflecting starlight that has traveled across distances so vast that the photons reaching your eyes began their journey before human beings had learned to build ships at all. This cosmic perspective transforms the rise and fall of dynasties, the building and abandonment of fleets, the lives and deaths of sailors and admirals into episodes in a story so large and ongoing that no single human lifetime can encompass its meaning. Yet you are part of that story too. Your quiet rest in this moment connected to all the human beings who have sought comfort and peace across the centuries, from ancient Chinese sailors rocking in their cramped hammocks to medieval monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, from Renaissance explorers dreaming of new worlds to modern astronauts floating in the vast silence of space. Sleep becomes a universal human experience that transcends all the differences of culture and circumstance that seem so important in our waking hours, a nightly return to the fundamental rhythms of breath and heartbeat that unite all living things. The treasure ships themselves have long since returned to the elements from which they were constructed, their massive timbers dissolved into soil that now nourishes new forests, their bronze fittings corroded into compounds that enrich the earth, their silk sails transformed into the very air you breathe. Nothing is truly lost, only transformed, reorganized into new patterns that carry forward the essential energy and matter of existence into forms we cannot yet imagine. The water that filled their holds may now fall as rain on your roof. The winds that filled their sails may now rustle the curtains at your window. The stars they used for navigation continue to wheel overhead in their eternal dance. This is the ultimate comfort that history offers to those who allow its lessons to settle gently into their understanding, the recognition that we are all temporary participants in patterns that extend far beyond our individual experience, waves in an ocean that has been flowing since time began and will continue flowing long after our particular contributions have merged back into the vast currents of existence. The anxiety of being merely human dissolves into the peace of being part of something infinite, something that encompasses all the treasure ships that have sailed and all that ever will sail, all the dreams that have been dreamed and all that remain to be discovered. Let this ancient story become your lullaby now. Its distant voice is joining the whisper of wind and the gentle settling of your house as it calls in the night air. The treasure ships sail on in the realm of memory and imagination, their crews at peace at last, their missions transformed from urgent necessities into eternal symbols of human courage and curiosity. You are safe in your warm bed, connected to their adventures, yet freed from their hardships, able to dream their dreams without suffering their struggles, able to honor their memory by allowing their story to carry you gently toward the vast ocean of sleep, where all boundaries dissolve and all voyagers find their rest at last.